Hello and welcome. My name is Robbie Knock, and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Professional Practice here at ArtCenter College of Design. And you are here for Web3 Pathways, Practices, and Possibilities. This is the kickoff to our summer series of programs on Web3. And we really imagine this as an entry point, not just for our audience today, but for our overall community to really investigate and explore not just the current trends and cycles around what we might know Web3 to be used for today, but where it's going and what are some of those near-term and longer-term opportunities for artists, designers, technologists, inventors, entrepreneurs across our ecosystem. So we are joined by a really remarkable panel here today, and I will give you a little sense of the flow of our program. So I'll introduce our panelists. They'll provide a little bit of context as to what brings them to Web3. They all come at it from quite different angles, and you'll hear from them on that. And then we will go into prepared questions that we've pulled from both audience submitted questions in the survey, as well as from some key topics that continue to come up in and around ArtCenter conversations across our community. Following the prepared questions, we'll have an opportunity for you to submit questions that come up during today. So please put those in the Q&A as they come up. You don't have to wait until the end to add them there, and we will pay attention to that throughout. And then we'll break at the end of the session and actually go straight into a workshop that Mer will lead with an incredible special guest, which I won't share with you just yet, but an opportunity to think through the workflow around starting to investigate and develop and explore the Web3 ecosystem. So that's our overall picture, and we've got a lot to cover. This topic is huge, and that's part of the reason we've addressed it over a series, and we really want to hear from you in this. So this initial conversation today is designed to set a bunch of different conversations in motion. Our next date, which we have not officially announced, but you'll want to keep on your calendar, will be July 9th. And that's going to be an opportunity to share case studies from within our community. So to look at student, alumni, faculty, and others who are actually building, developing, and creating work in the Web3 space. And then throughout the rest of the summer, we will break out into smaller groups to address topic-specific conversations. So we might see a group emerge around NFTs, around the metaverse, around decentralized finance, around the applications that are being built on top of blockchain, and sort of tokenization at large. And this is really an opportunity for you to steer us. So we don't have all the answers, and this world that we're in right now is emerging and evolving really, really quickly. I think Sarah said recently that like 2 months is like 2 years in this space, and I couldn't agree more. So we want to hear from you in that. What are you doing? Where are you investigating? What is your work needing in terms of guidance and additional resources within the ArtCenter and our broader community around us? So I guess with that, I will dive into the intros here, and I'll run through all of our speakers, and then they'll have an opportunity to discuss more specifics about what brings them to the table. So first, we have Sarah Conley Odenkirk. Sarah is a partner and co-head of art law and NFT practice group at Cohen Debates, Abrahams and Shepherd. She has a background as a fine art attorney, taught for many years at the Sotheby's Institute, in the Claremont colleges, and has really watched the evolution of digital art, intellectual property, and creativity at large, and plays a really critical role in helping lots of different stakeholders understand where their intellectual property runs against these new technologies, and what that might mean for an individual, for a collector, for any number of other participants in the world around art and digital artwork. So that's Sarah. And next we have Ryan Roybal. Ryan's an alum of our transportation program here at ArtCenter. Had a career working in innovation at Audi and in and around the transportation space, and has recently founded two Web3 oriented businesses, NFT Collective, which is focused on artwork and in the NFT space, as well as Aspekt.ai, which is a metaverse architecture collaborative. So we'll hear from Ryan on that. Next in our group is Mer Walker. Mer is an absolute pioneer when it comes to technology, creativity, digital communication, and the entire ecosystem of startups and legacy businesses. His career has really spanned architecture, design, advertising, emerging technology across Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, and where we're going next with all of this. He currently serves and oversees digital media for ORIGYN Foundation, based out of Switzerland. You'll learn more about that. And importantly, Mer actually taught a class in the advertising department in 2013, focused on cryptocurrency and what might be built on top of that new way of working, new way of thinking about economies and tokens and value. So that's Mer. And then our last speaker and panelist today is Maggie Hendrie. Many of you know Maggie through ArtCenter. She's our chair of graduate media design practices and the interaction design program. And she has had a career that has touched so many aspects of what core enabling technologies come into the Web3 ecosystem. She's just an incredible guide through thinking about what's new and what's really just the repackaging of something that we've been doing for quite a while now. And to really help understand the history and legacy of some of these technologies and what the impact that those histories might have on their future use. So we'll get into all of that over the course of today. And what we don't address today, we know we won't cover it all. We will address over the course of the summer series and eventually through classes and programs and lots of other engagement through ArtCenter and beyond. So with that, Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you to give us your intro and what brings you to Web3 in an overview.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me here today. This is a very exciting panel to be on. And I think you told us that we should get into fights today. So hopefully we'll have a little bit of excitement as we get through some of these topics. So as Robbie already pointed out, I'm an art lawyer, and I practice with a law firm that is based in both LA and New York, which has been kind of great for this practice because so much is happening really all around the world, but certainly being able to be on both coasts at the same time essentially has been really interesting and exciting to see how things are continuing to evolve. I started getting involved with concepts around cryptocurrency, blockchain, and eventually NFTs, not super early like Mer, but in about 2017 when there were a number of blockchain related art projects that started really making some noise, and I realized how interesting it was as a possibility for the conceptual artists that I worked with. And so engaged in a number of conversations and organized some salon conversations around the topic in general. And then, of course, when the Beeple sale hit in February of last year and March, that was, everything exploded. And so one of the artists that I've worked particularly closely with is Nancy Baker Cahill, who is somebody I think is going to be appearing in some of your other presentations this summer. And I know she's teaching a course at ArtCenter as well with Jesse Damiani. And she and I really started to talk about a lot of the concerns and questions that we had around artists' involvement in Web3 and with regard to NFTs. And so what had previously been my window into the art world and into artist practice through my law practice became a little bit more collaborative. And that's pretty exciting because there really aren't a lot of standards for us to rely on here. So we're kind of making up some of this stuff as we go along, which has been an interesting shift in terms of how I practice law. And it's also been incredibly gratifying to be able to really collaborate with my clients and participate in developing some of the conceptual as well as the practical underpinnings for their projects. And so with that, I will pass it along to the next speaker.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. And I'll hand it over now to you, Ryan. Oh, and you're on mute there.
There we go. Now we're unmuted. No, it's very excited to join everyone today. Thank you for having me. Very much a pleasure and great to meet some new people always. Just try to do like a quick short little intro for me. So yes, as an alum from ArtCenter, I did have a career for approximately 10 years at Audi here in Germany. And towards the end of that, I started really getting heavily into the Web3 world. And being in the strategy department for the company, we started to really play around with a lot of new innovative technologies and get a really good grasp on like kind of how tech trends were developing, where they were going. And something for me that's I hold dearly was how I saw the possibility of like artist empowerment being something that was ingrained into this Web3 culture. So at that point, at the early, like late 2020, early 2021 is when I started to develop my own companies and really tried to think of how we could build something on the Web3 platform that would have this embodiment for artist empowerment and kind of like how we could discuss smart contracts and royalties and splits and all these types of things. So yeah, that was kind of like my entry into the space. And since then, I've just been quite busy. All last year was kind of spent during the tour around the US or the world in relationship to Web3. So many summits, shows, events, gallery speakings, and all these types of things. So it's really been ultimately an incredible time to meet artists and creatives around the globe. In NFT Collective, we have artists all the way from Japan to the US to Canada. And it's really great to see like all of these diverse personalities, influences and narratives that artists want to share through their body of work. And now that we have a tool set to give these voices or to give a platform to these voices, I think it's something that's truly, truly special. So a few programs that I work on with Vertical Crypto Art Residency Program, been one of the mentors since the beginning, and we get to meet artists all around the globe who've not been able to really monetize on their creative instincts. And now with Web3, we have that ability to really give that platform for these people to now create and have an audience that maybe they didn't exist in their home network. So it's really rewarding to see this. A few other things working on at the moment are Aspekt, which is our metaverse architecture firm, where we're really focused on inclusiveness on how these experiences can be had via Web3, how we can take people into 3D digital environments that have an immersive experience that might touch them on an interpersonal level that they might not be able to have on a physical space. And then most importantly, I think that when people are in these digital spaces, how we can play with the connection between the in real life experience and the digital experience. So we really focus a lot on what we call the digital and physical bridge. So how we can actually empower people to then have an extended experience in the physical world, or maybe go backwards, because we're seeing a lot of people, especially during the pandemic, had that, there was a disconnect from the physical space. So how can we give a platform or a space for people to congregate and meet, maybe digitally, but then actually bring that conversation into the physical world to meet in real life, which I think is something that as humans really plays an important balance in who we are as individuals and how we develop. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan. And I'm gonna have to apologize here. I'm at ArtCenter's campus and we have a little bit of construction noise, so bear with me on that. I hope it is filtered out through Zoom. Anyway, moving on, next to Lemaire. Lemaire, also an alum I didn't mention in my little intro. Lemaire, share with us what brings you to the room and the conversation.
Yeah, this is really exciting on a Saturday. Everyone's taking time to level up and to kind of expand and to get to see and to know different perspectives, which is kind of my passion that's been driving me to explore a lot of the different fields that you mentioned, Robbie. And, you know, this panelist is incredible, and what you guys are able to do at the school in terms of the nimbleness to design a program like this is really unique. And I'm super happy to be part of this community. So my background kind of started in the early days of looking at architecture as a challenge for myself to figure out where could my interests around innovation, around aesthetics, around usability all kind of meet. And halfway through that program, I got introduced to web design. It was the Web 1 days. And in fact, even your invite, I think I told you, that was literally one of the first aesthetic kind of looks that I was able to achieve back in those early days with the simple 3D modeling programs and the websites at that time. So I never forgot the nexus point that the web provided me to blend all the arts, whereupon I then did grad school at ArtCenter. And while I was there, having part-time gigs working with the production community here in LA on advertising, film, experimental media, even VR back in the ancient days, all those things were really intriguing and kind of equally as daunting as Web3 seems to be for a lot of people now. So I've always had a kind of a yearning to find the fringe of what's next and what's coming, and to go into that without any fear of it not necessarily being completely clear and very ambiguous, but then trying to apply those design aesthetics to it alongside usability. So I can kind of wrap it up by saying, I'm really excited about this stage of where Web3 now is. When I was doing classes at ArtCenter in both graphic design with interaction, where I got to meet Maggie when she first came in, as well as working with the advertising students, where my mission with introducing it to both classes was to see how did the younger generations react to what was quite radical at the time, and still is for a lot of people, around this notion of both currency and a new model of computing that could unlock all kinds of new value. And it was really difficult to explain at the time, probably still is in some cases, but I think we're now at a place where we can see the examples of some of the factors coming to life, and they have friction, both ethically and practically, that we're looking to balance out. So this is an incredible forum to start that dialogue and to start exploring what can ArtCenter community members do with this incredible world of technology that we've got in our hands now.
Thanks, Mer. And lastly, Maggie.
Thank you. And thank you, Robbie, for bringing such an incredible panel. And I'm looking at our attendees and community members, an incredible group of people together. I think one of the things about being engaged in both education and interaction as a practitioner is that you're always trying to identify and evaluate and experiment with new medium and new platform, right? We know this right back to whether we're net art, right? Or software as a design practice. So I think as an educator, I'm interested and frankly a little cynical and concerned, as well as inspired by the kind of really very quite complex and intersecting areas of like technology capability, crypto speculation, digital content markets, multiple business models. How do we learn and how do we kind of co-teach and emerge as designers who have an ethical and meaningful practice? I think that's something that we'll always be grappling with, but I feel committed to providing some touchstones and methods along the way. And then as a designer, I'm interested in what it is that designers bring specifically to this space. So we've talked a little bit, as I mentioned, about technology capabilities or emerging financial models, but there's a user experience that has some inherent tensions, right? So when we talk about Web3, for example, being permissionless or being trustless, right? Those are features that when you come to design for a human being who may be engaging with this medium for the first time, there's inherently tension. So designing for trust, progressive disclosure, may mean increasing friction, right? When something is irreversible, we might need a different kind of friction, which is actually a new form of thinking about design patterns, metaphors. We see this emerging in decentralized applications, which are kind of basically apps as we know them, but now many of them built off an Ethereum blockchain. So I'm also really interested in the detail of design and what it is that people who do participatory design research, iterative prototyping, modeling, what it is we as designers bring to this domain that others might not. So I guess three things. There's what it means to be digital content creators and where there's value and opportunity in new models for our creative community. Education, how do we build pathways so people can discern what's right for them? And then thirdly, what are some of those design artifacts, objects, methodologies that we can bring to the table?
Excellent. So much to explore there. And I think this is an opportunity to maybe start with a really big picture question for you, Sarah, and to help us set our understanding of the different components that we talk about within Web3, from blockchain and cryptocurrency to NFTs, the metaverse, decentralized applications, and so on. Could you give us your imagining that we don't know anything and we're in the middle of some kind of legal challenge?
Uh-oh. Well, I will say that, you know, as I mentioned in my brief introduction, my initial foray into this area really had to do with how could it be useful for the artists who I work with who are doing conceptual work, and how could we think of this as new packaging for ideas. And so when everything went bonkers last year, and it was clear that it was going to take over my practice pretty much entirely, it was drinking from a fire hose, trying to understand and learn all the technology, trying to understand all the different players, trying to parse through the enormous pile of business decks that I was being sent that were garbage, frankly, not all of them. But, you know, for every 100 business decks that I looked through, there were maybe one or two that made sense and appeared to be legit. So part of that initial process of how do I give advice to people, how do I talk to artists about this, was about figuring out ways to explain things in very simple terms, not because people are stupid, but just because this is such a complex ecosystem. There's so much to understand. And the people who are involved in the ecosystem oftentimes are newer than any of us here, or even anybody who's listening today. And so they're trying to, you know, bluster and bluff their way through. The ecosystem still is held together in large part by, as I keep saying, Band-Aids and bubblegum, because not every aspect of what people are being promised functions at this point. So we've got a lot of different things to parse through. So to get to your question about how would I present something for people who don't know anything, the best metaphor that I've come up with for the ecosystem is a layer cake. And that's something that made a lot of sense to me, especially since I like cake. But it also made sense in terms of the relationship amongst the different aspects of the ecosystem. So the bottom layer is the blockchain, and that's sort of the foundation on which everything rests. That's the building blocks for everything that we're seeing now. And the fact is that blockchain doesn't necessarily have anything to do with NFTs, right? So the blockchain could exist without NFTs. On top of the blockchain, we have cryptocurrency. And so cryptocurrency relies on the immutable ledger capabilities of blockchain to maintain the information of cryptocurrency. And then on top of that, the icing on the cake is the NFTs. So the NFTs, again, like in coming up with different metaphors to explain how to view NFTs, I think unfortunately and I have a lot of noise here too. Mine is not construction. It's a teenage boy playing video games. So pardon any shouting you hear in the background. So part of the problem is that I think people are so overwhelmed with all the technology involved in the space that they start to think of NFTs as being a super complex thing. And there is some complexity there, but really I prefer to think of them as an empty cardboard box as opposed to some, space age technology. I mean, it is space age technology, but ultimately it's agnostic packaging into which you can put anything. So thinking about that layer cake and thinking about an empty cardboard box does make this entire conversation a little bit more approachable for me and for the people who I talk to. So hopefully that helps just in terms of positioning the conversation. And I'll just end with a couple of pieces of advice that I tend to give, and this is not legal advice. This is just my observational advice, having been in the space now for a couple of years. And actually, I just was asked by somebody to give like the pithy, most direct advice that I would give to artists. So one thing I would say is make sure you understand why you're using NFTs. How does it fit into your practice? Does it make sense? Is it practical? Is it, does it add something? Or are you just throwing stuff in that cardboard box and shipping it out the door? And that's going to really go to whether the project is successful in large part. And we can talk more about this as we get into our conversation, but the conversation has changed over the last year and a half. Initially, it was all about how do I apply NFTs to my practice? But the fact is that NFTs should be viewed as another tool within the practice, not a goal and an end in and of themselves. It's important, and we can get into this as well, it's important to understand the limits of that technology, what is being promised versus what can actually be delivered. There's a lot of conversation around resale royalties, which is fantastic. I love talking about resale royalties and what it can do for artists and other creators. The fact is it's still not a perfect delivery system for that sustainable annuity income that sometimes is being promised. And then the last thing is to really understand the marketplace. That is a piece that got left out for way too long in this incredibly crazy ramp up that happened, where people really weren't paying attention to who's going to buy the stuff. So great, you figured out how to make an NFT, you've put your stuff on chain. Now what? Who's buying it? It's not magical. There is nothing that automatically happens in terms of sales. You still have to think about marketplace, audience, community, all of those things which are really integral to Web3, but also it's not an easy fix to a lot of the problems that artists face. You're still essentially building a new business from the ground up if you decide to go into NFTs. So with that, I will stop and let somebody else talk.
Well, that's actually a great bridge to Mer here, and to help us understand from an ORIGYN perspective and beyond, what's happening at a computational level? What's the sort of easy way to understand how blockchain servers, proof of work, proof of authentication, proof of action ultimately plays out in systems of infrastructure, servers, computers, decentralized across the globe? What does that look like, and how is it slightly different than what we've come to know as the internet?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great bridge. Sarah, I'm sorry you had to sit through so many lame decks. Those do proliferate when you get derivative attempts to take some of the use cases that are truly brilliant that were laid out in 14, 15, 16 by a lot of the consensus people, frankly. And I got a chance to see some of that stuff while I was with BCG, where we were kind of thinking through how does this scale? And that's a key question, Robbie, that I can kind of dive into in terms of everything that we've been talking about at ORIGYN and the Internet Computer and other ecosystems that are now looking at interoperability alongside the scalability factors. The initial model of having transactional, let's say, tolls and fees to pay has reached its limit. It reached it several times over the last couple of years. And that's been a trigger point for a lot of people to look at the infrastructure in a different way. So the idea of the distributed computing, as Sarah also laid it out in terms of the security levels and the computation and the confirmations that go around throughout the networks, there's an incredibly smart set of protocols that are out there that have different mechanisms around it, but ultimately they are synchronizing the information database so that it's safe and it's replicable and can't be tampered with in the best cases. But what's been missing, though, is the ability for the design of the infrastructure of the kind of data centers themselves, which is something that we focused on, where we've actually designed our own spec of the actual server infrastructure that allows us to truly have things on chain and on the same server instance, so that your logic and your content and your smart contracts are all self-contained and interoperating in a way that is also impenetrable to a lot of these attacks that are coming through right now. So I would say a lot of the core principles of running a startup, as Sarah also pointed out, you really are doing that when you're setting up an NFT, because the NFTs of the future are going to actually have the capacity to be marketplaces themselves. They're going to have the capacity to be brand delivery mechanisms themselves. No longer will you have kind of a quote unquote dumb NFT graphic sitting on a website that is speculative only. You actually have a full ecosystem of operability within the actual NFT container. And that's completely up to you as a Rorschach, what you will see and what you will do with it. But ultimately, the infrastructure itself is upgrading very quickly. And as we go into this dip bear market, it might last for quite a while, I think the innovation is going to get even more exponential as we now see what a lot of the core market behaviors have been around it, and that they can scale up, because they currently are still relying on a lot of legacy 1.0 Ethereum models. And I think that's going to get drastically expanded as Ethereum upgrades and other systems come on board. So it's a very exciting time in terms of the innovation that's happening around these issues, and a lot of the, let's call it dross, the things that have been kind of, let's say, have considered that don't really have value. I think they're really going to fade away, because a lot of the things that we're talking about, where we can take a physical good and have it really be brought on as a digital twin through scanning or through the native digital object that then becomes the true master recording of value. And what happens with that, again, is totally scalable and applicable to all kinds of industries. Those are all things that we're expanding our capabilities with by working with different artists, different manufacturers, and so forth, to really kind of take industry to market with these capabilities, and not so much kind of over-rotating on the hype factor of a speculative market. We're really kind of focusing on the bigger endeavors that artists and industry captains want to see happen.
Can I ask a question, Mer? Maybe you or even Ryan can speak to this. When you get off that Web1 platform and you start looking at edge computing and decentralized data networks, how much of the environmental impacts and that environmental factor do you feel is being built into this forward-looking framework?
I definitely want to hear Ryan's take on this, because his team is doing some incredible work there. I'll just give you a quick little snippet of how we're responding to it. Because we're actually operating our own data center network, our energy usage and the new machines that we've applied within those data centers are hyper efficient. And because we're also not relying on the Amazons, the Googles, and so forth in their data centers, we have a much more transparent and fully inclusive energy model of what transactions really cost. So, I could give you a lot of numbers right now, but it's best served to say that our advantage is lying in our full stack and the approach that we've taken there. But I think Ryan's probably got a much better response than I do on that.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, From our perspective, I think that there's a lot going on in the ecosystem. I'll go a little technical on this discussion because I think it's important to have a little understanding of the differentiation between different chains. So we do have what's called proof of work, and we have proof of stake. So proof of work is what the Ethereum blockchain is based on, and proof of stake is what, for example, Tezos blockchain is based on. So the Tezos blockchain is approximately 1/10,000th of an environmental impact that the Ethereum blockchain is using right now. So what this means is basically the gas fees, which is what the cost of the cost per transaction on the blockchain to the user and to the environment is the 1/10,000th of that on the Ethereum. So we're seeing a lot of artists that are gravitating towards this chain. There's also other great chains like Solana that's also getting a lot of traction at the moment as well. And with these blockchains, for example, Tezos, a lot of the artists are gravitating towards this because of their strong innate beliefs in the environment. Some of them are saying we will never publish work on Ethereum due to the environmental impact that makes. And I think this is something that really needs a lot of attention, especially within the press, because there's not so much light being shed on this at the moment. There's some great papers that I can recommend, some really great articles that really dive deep and get into all the technicalities behind this. But it's something that people need to be aware of, that there is a solution, and that's the beautiful thing I think that's going on in Web3 is that, we have these initial situations that are basically proposed to us. And then we have companies or individuals or groups or communities that are saying, okay, well, we don't like that as well, but we're going to get to work and try to find a solution. And that's something that's really happening at an extraordinarily rapid pace, especially within this community.
So Ryan, I actually have a question for you to follow up on that, which is that one of the things I hear from artists, I do hear that people are very concerned about the environment, which is, of course, something we should all be very concerned about. But then that's sometimes has to be balanced with marketability of what you're creating on blockchain. And one of the problems with the either layer 2 or proof of stake chains is that the secondary marketplaces aren't as built out as they are on Ethereum. Many of the crypto collectors are only collecting on the Ethereum blockchain. And so as an artist who's actually trying to sell work, how do you balance the environmental impact versus the ability to easily sell the works that you're creating?
Great question. Love it. I feel that it all comes down to community. We do deal with a lot of very high level collectors who have been collecting within the contemporary art world for many, many decades. And they do propose the same question. And I think it does come down to community and how the community reacts and also supports the artists amongst the community. And there are certain blockchains, like I mentioned before, the Tezos one. I'm not going to continue to go on and on about it, but it is beautiful because they do have an artist community that is ingrained within that blockchain. So there's a lot of events like they call Object for Object, which is when artists and creatives create free NFTs for like a very small period of time, and people who collect them then have that opportunity to get their work at a fraction of the price or for free for that matter. And then we start to see secondary sales increase exponentially. For example, at Art Basel, like I believe it was last week in Hong Kong, Tezos was there. They had some very prolific artists that were offering pieces for free. And we immediately saw secondary markets exploding, going from like 100 to 300 or somewhere even up to 600 Tezos right now. So when we write into this smart contract, which is the beautiful part of it, I believe, is that when artists are going to get 10, 20% royalties on secondary sales, we're starting to see a shift in this paradigm where before artists had to monetize on large primary sales. Now that we're seeing there's an opportunity for them to have a large volume of a collection. For example, like FX Hash has been doing 1,000 piece collections. And when we're seeing these works go for 500, 600 Tezos, which is roughly 1,000 to 1,400 USD on secondary market, this is adding up pretty substantially to have more profits for the artist on their secondary sales than on the primary sales.
So I just want to pop in with one last thing and then I'll be quiet, at least for a little bit. The last layer of my layer cake analogy is the candles on top of the cake. And I make that the resale royalties. Because one of the problems is that there's not as much interoperability as people would like between platforms. So if you imagine the resale royalties as the candles on the cake, when you walk from one room to the next, the wind blows out the candles and you still have the royalties in the smart contract, but they're not recognized on the other platform. And so, this is I think a really big problem in terms of touting resale royalties as being something that artists can count on. They can only count on it if the transactions continue to happen within the same environment, and not if things are being ported around or transferred onto other chains. So what's your thought about the future? And I guess either Ryan or Lemaire, like, what's your thought about the future of interoperability and how that will impact artists with the resale royalties?
I'll take this one on. One of the things that's been really exciting about what we're doing with ORIGYN and Internet Computer, we're also seeing it on the systems like Polkadot, cross-chain cryptographic communication instead of using bridges, which require wrapping, which typically breaks the smart contract functionality, is the next wave. So your tokens remain sovereign on their native chain, but you can communicate and interoperate with them across chain through these mechanisms. I think that's going to be quite a boon in terms of preserving the original smart contract intentionality. And the way that we're structuring our smart contracts within the canisters, as we call them, on the Internet Computer, is that they have this as a native function. It's not something that you need to have your developers figure out a way to port in. It's actually part and parcel of how it's supposed to communicate, even with Bitcoin. And so with that, you have a much smarter and much more durable way that you can have perpetual contracts that do include these royalty guarantees. And in fact, that's also why our NFTs are actually insured. We have a full insurance policy on anything that's coming through our system, that if the buyer ends up having bought an apocryphal or problematic NFT, they will be covered, and we'll handle on the backside what happened with that minting process. So it's going to be a very big deal to get the artist rights baked into the smart contract in a durable way going forward.
Well, this is a perfect indicator of why Web3 is such a important topic for the ArtCenter community, because it is art and design coming together in very different ways with very different timelines and expectations. So, and Maggie, this will be a bridge to you, which is some in our community might approach the engagement with this space through the end results of the artwork, and how that artwork might live in a digital space or a physical space or some hybrid of those, or in a VR or AR application. And then there's a part of the community that's coming in through code and through development and the various programming stacks that are required to actually set up a new system or change a system. So can you help us understand from your perspective how you're teaching those or guiding learning in those two different models?
Yeah, well, there's many. My layer cake also looks a little bit like, what does full stack development look like? But I think one of the things that's really specific, or at least has emerged in the last 10, 15 years, is that designers are very aware of the larger ecosystem in which their work lives. Right. So we are seeing our interaction designers and others being called upon by startups, major companies to come and design the user interface, the user experience, or some of the technologies that enable these new models. Right. So when we're thinking about that, there's obviously some very practical things that are, what are the new metaphors, the new design patterns? And I can put some stuff in the chat where people can go look at, these are emergent, and it's an amazing place for people to look at how do you design these. There's a guy called Beltran on Medium writes quite a bit about that. I'm just popping that in. So I think there's that interface aspect, all of this complexity that we've just described, the mental model about, where does my token live? What does it mean that it's non-fungible? How is my cryptocurrency, or is my token, can it be exchanged? Is it transferable in a cryptocurrency market? All of that needs to be exposed in a certain way, at a certain pace, at the right level. And I think, like many technologies, that'll change over time as people become more literate. But there is I think there should be a requirement that there be legibility built into the interfaces and the interactions within these systems. So that's a design challenge at the interface level. But I was talking a little bit about understand, and if we ask, I really appreciate Sarah's question or comment that this is a tool in your practice, it's not an end in itself necessarily. I would also ask people to think, what business are you in, right? And people say, I'm in the NFT business, right? I would just say that some of the inherent tensions I hear, or as I mentioned when we talk about trustlessness, which is a technology concept, is not a great concept for the general public. Airbnb was not built on that way, right? And I was reminded yesterday of a comment, I think it was Alan Chochnov made, who said designers often think they're designing artifacts, but in fact they're designing consequences. So I would ask designers to really use their scenario building, their use cases, their personas, their whole way of modeling different outcomes and use cases, and to be really asking for whom, to understand where it fits. And in that larger world, another kind of contradiction I sometimes hear when I ask, what business are you in? We talk about decentralized autonomous organizations, right? And I'm curious about for whom, because I think by the end of last year, it was Marc Andreessen and Horowitz who'd made about 40% of the investment in venture capital in this domain, right? And that is not a DAO, that's a venture capital corporation, right? So there's a tension inherent in the language we use about the technology and the bigger world in which some of these initiatives live. And I think our students are sensitive to that. They want to do really meaningful work. And I'll finish with this and turn it over to Mer. There is an amazing opportunity for designers to get right in there at the very nascent beginnings, not just as content providers, but as systems designers, and to bring their form of design into that. And I think DApps are a great place if people want to start learning how to do UI and interaction. I think that the requirement for like participatory design, and also a reflection on, is this design being applied in, you know, fintech or healthcare or art markets? So it's not one size fits all, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think designers should not only learn how to design these systems well, they should also learn, what questions do I need to ask of the community that I'm engaging with in order to do my design work. Just in the same way an artist has a whole set of questions, you know, that Sarah helps them navigate. I know Mer's thoughts on this as a designer. And
yeah, no, really great points. I just wanted to chime in on the point that you were making about when venture capital basically kind of became very evident in the background of what's been happening here in the last decade or so with this space. You know, Marc Andreessen is one of the most brilliant venture capitalists in history. He was also a maker, right? Netscape and so forth. But, you know, there's a friction there of what do these open software ecosystems portend for the future, and who owns them, who gets to profit from them going forward. The other aspect of what I picked up on there is this, I think is important for everybody in the community to know that you're not necessarily designing a business always with these tools. You could be designing a impact collective, right? You could be designing a truly autonomous piece of software that performs a service. It really is about your strategy and your intention. If you want to go and make a new bank, so be it. If you want to make an open source tool to enable people to have money conversion using a mobile phone, guess what? You can actually do it with this stuff. So it really is coming back as what you want as a palette, as a builder, and then as an artist. You know, going back to the early Web 1 and Web 2 days where the interfaces became the actual art. I love seeing that stuff, and I'm seeing it more and more in the NFT space, at least right now, where a lot of the design patterns and conventions are absolutely acknowledged, but they're also overlaid with story and fun and creativity that a certain community is going to be drawn to, that then propels that as something that grows into an economic phenomenon. So I think that's where I'm excited about where this community can take things.
so too, and I think I shared a link in the chat. I think there's things that as designers we can really hone in on, and that's like the transparency of data provenance, right? So like people know which data comes from blockchain, which doesn't, what is independent, what does it mean to be authenticated, that you're on a D app, not a regular app. And that that people understand where the value is. Can be as simple as Ryan was saying, is showing you what your gas costs are, right through to actually showing where your tokens live. And I think that they're emerging, I don't want to call them best practices, but the more we look at the detailed, if we listen to the questions people ask as they navigate, I'm more a proponent for the end user, right? And I do think that's where Andreessen and Horowitz did incredible work, right? Was making an end user experience of Web 1 absolutely tangible and manageable, and that became a platform. So I think some of those principles about like transaction history, the same transparency in the interface as there is in the code, understanding the different natures of contracts, I think that's actually a form of legibility and what I would call just being able to understand how contracts work in today's world, right? So I'm not entirely negative about it. I want us to do it really well.
Right.
And I think that's why I came to ArtCenter, right? It's like, how do we do these things really well? And I saw Julian's question about where's the responsibility of an individual designer. And I think part of the role of an educator is preparing our students to go out and get internships, go out and do collaborations, go out. So in some ways it's going armed with a set of questions and underlying principles that they can then go investigate. Right. And just like sustainability, the questions about it have kind of prompted a kind of different Web3 technology infrastructure. I think those questions can also be applied to the candles and the top tier of that cake, right?
Well, and Sarah, maybe to break just a really specific bridge. In a podcast you were on recently, I heard you talk about Clickwrap Agreements and sort of help us understand how that type of a historical digital permission might play into what we're seeing in all of these different strands of use and transparency.
So this, I kept trying to jump in just because this is what gets me very excited, which I realize makes me a big, huge contract nerd. The smart contracts are not actually contracts at this point. It's code that has if-then transactions built into it. But if you're talking about specific terms that people agree to, we're talking about documents that are either separately drafted and stored on, on a server and linked to an NFT. We're talking about terms and conditions on a website. We're talking about frequently asked questions on a website. So we have to be very careful about our use of the word contract. I've been advocating since the beginning that we not use the word smart contract for the actual inner workings of the NFT because it's confusing. People assume that there's an actual contract there, when in fact it's not an actual contract. It is it's the rules of how that technical piece works. So there are companies that are working on integrating those things into Maggie, both Maggie and Lemer's comments about the transparency and the interface and how users are interacting with NFTs and anything else that's on the blockchain. Like these things will come together at some point, I think. But for now, it's very important to understand that we're working our way through establishing standards, protocols, and best practices. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the uproar around CryptoPunks and the fact that they did not allow commercial rights to travel with their NFTs, whereas Bored Apes, another profile picture project or PFP, allows for a very wide range of commercial rights to go along with that ownership. So you've got very divergent approaches being used by different projects in terms of what the end user can use. How do you know? How do you know what rights you're getting with that NFT? How do you know what's appropriate and not to do with that artwork that you've purchased? And So back to your original question about Clickwrap, you know, with the software law, that sort of emerged as the way to have a meeting of the minds between the user and the provider of the information. You know, whether or not we can embed the same kind of agreements. And, you know, of course, part of the problem is very few people, I mean, I don't want to say no one, but very few people read those terms of service before you have to scroll down and say, I agree, or, you know, I understand and agree before I proceed with whatever I want to do. And yet that is an important part of the exchange if we're going to create real contracts. And so I would say to people, like, I don't love reading all of those agreements either. And do I read every Apple license that I get or every update that I get before I click I agree? No, I don't. Maybe that's terrible, but I don't. Because what's your option is to not use the product then. Nevertheless, we do need to specifically and clearly set out those terms and give users an opportunity to opt in or not. And that's going to go to supporting the Web3 ethos as well, because there is this overall desire to make things more equitable, more fair. And so again, back to what Maggie was saying about who the players are in the space, we do have, there's a lot of friction and conflict right now because we still have big money interests driving the bus. But we also at the same time want to give the little creator, the small person in the space, the ability to engage, interact, and benefit from their creative contributions. So how we balance those things, how we build that out, you know, again, a somewhat biased perspective, but I think it has everything to do with the articulation of relationships and the articulation of rights and the exchange of information that happens, whether it's in an open source context or within a proprietary context, but, you know, all within that Web3 environment.
I just wanted to.
And over to you, Ryan, on that one, because you identified this interesting moment where some of the builders and folks that are really developing the systems, and then some of the content artists, designers, people focused on the outcome or the experience of those systems are starting to find new ways of connecting and communicating. Can you help us understand what that's looking like culturally and across the sort of some of the different zones that we've been discussing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just from firsthand experience when we were at the Bitcoin conference in Miami in 2021 last year. Man, it feels like 3 years ago now. But anyways, we saw like a convergence. We had a lot of events that we've been hosting from the beginning of the conference to the end. And we kind of saw these two different camps of like the creatives and then the traditional crypto people. And by the end of the event, we started to see this convergence. And for me, that signified where we were heading with the space and the open-mindedness of the culture. I think that's something really special. To kind of tie into everything that everyone's been saying, we're all kind of talking about the same thing, but there's one personal thing that came up to me that seems to be quite indicative to this, which is the fact that I believe that, I would predict that this year, 2022, we're going to start to see protocols, collections, creations, whatever you want to call them, that are actually going to be like personifying and having built in full transparency from the beginning. And I think that's something that we haven't seen yet within the space. Like going back to the PFP collections that Sarah was talking about and rights, that's definitely one very important factor. And I think that we've learned a lot from that. But I think that we really need to start to think about what the framework, the foundational idea is, what Satoshi originally thought of when the white papers were written, and how we then can go back to that and make sure that we're actually implementing what blockchain was built for into the types of pieces of artwork, side chains, protocols, marketplaces, everything that surrounds it. And I think that this year, I'm predicting that we will start to see this big step where we're going to say projects that will be released that will be fully decentralized for the first time. And I think this is what we need in order to start to lay the next foundation of how to continue to build on top of that. And one more thing, I think this goes back to what Robbie was asking, is I think we have many verticals going on within the space at the moment. Going back to what Maggie said about how the interface, how UX, how all these types of things can be integrated. I think it's more about, it will be a seamless integration in the end, where we don't even see or recognize that this is something that is not part of the artwork. It will be an encompassing portion of the artwork, and that's the beauty of everything. I think that we're seeing a lot of what's called creative coding, which is actually coders who are creating artwork based on writing code. So we'll have ASCII code that will then create a generative image. That was basically the foundation. Now we've moved into what's called P5JS, which is giving visual representation to that. And I think that once we have seen both of these verticals kind of like uplift at the same time, there's going to be this moment of convergence, and that's where the beauty is going to really lie, I think.
Sarah can speak more to this, but generative art has been a foundational part of, like, you know, net art. It's actually kind of interesting to me that on the other side of it, you can get a Figma plugin for an NFT UI, right? You can, it's already a kind of currency that people are debating. And I too agree. I think that as it rolls out into the user experience, as designers get to see it kind of live in the field with non-technical users, I think a lot of these tensions will either bubble up and need to be resolved, or the design process will actually understand how to make them more legible and usable. I'm kind of jumping over because I was curious when Mer posted his document about Vitalik Buterin's work that touches on the question Camille asked. And that is that even within those frameworks that we're trying to design for usability, there's still loads and loads of emerging concepts and tools and ideas. And one of them right now is soulbound, right?
Right, right. So it actually ties back to, I think, a lot of the points Sarah was making about the nature of a contract within the space. The phrase smart contract, most of the developers and engineers that I've ever engaged with feel like that's a misnomer for sure. But there are things like OpenLaw, for instance, which is an Ethereum-based group that has created a whole collection of true contracts that are all automated. They're really basic things like MOUs and so forth that really rely on kind of a certain state's set of laws. But there are ways to kind of get there, and I think they're doing great work in that regard. But with regard to Soulbound, what's really interesting is that scarcity and assignability and addressability of that model for a particular piece of work. Let's say it's a one-of-one piece of work, of which we've got some things that are coming through our pipeline that are designed to be that way. It's really interesting when you design it as such to get rid of the sometimes fraudulent or manipulative things that can happen around it, but also the experiential factors get heightened incredibly by doing that. And you can also have a true contract at the center of it, in my opinion, in terms of how that can actually be instantiated and written. Maybe it's written in a Ricardian way, so it's actually written in actual King's English versus code. But either way, I think those are definitely coming down the pike for us all as another layer of opportunity to create the interaction between a creator and a collector.
I think some of that goes also to the chorus of voices asking, what do you get when you buy an NFT? And so for those people who aren't impressed with the unique digital ownership of something, having utility and other features embedded in that NFT experience, I think is really important, which in my view means that what we're going to see is, and I think everybody has been sort of pointing toward this in everything we've been saying today, is that NFTs are going to recede into the background. It's nobody's going to care so much about what an NFT is, or whether it is an NFT or not. They're going to be looking at the experience, the artwork, the utility, the engagement. What is it that purchase buys me? What is it that engagement gets me to? And so whether it's an NFT or whatever the next packaging, technological packaging is, like, I think that as the designers take over that user interface space and make stuff that's truly accessible to the vast majority of people, because still, even those of us who have been operating in this bubble and feel like everybody knows what an NFT is, most people still don't know what NFTs are. Most people don't know what blockchain is. They don't want to take the time or spend the energy to do that. But when you present it to them in a way that allows them to engage easily, I think that then we really will see the revolution take over, and this technology will become world changing instead of just sort of within an insular group.
And maybe there, just to bridge back to Mer, something that I think we should talk about is the kind of workflow, and we'll get into that in the workshop, but really help us understand some of the collections and artworks and objects that you're working with, and what are the concerns along that pathway of object, digital, process, scanning, photo, obviously then storage on a server, access to that storage, potentially minting or on-chaining that particular digital file or information, and then ultimately doing something with it, showing it to somebody, looking at it, experiencing it. What are you seeing in that workflow, and how do we start sort of the object to end result that a lot of these collections or object archives or artwork museums, etc., are going through?
You covered it quite well there, actually, but just in terms of looking at it across the different verticals that we have, where we have the art practice, which is focusing on galleries and museums, and also the blue chip art market. What do those three groups primarily want? Well, it turns out they want, as close as they can get to a 100% provenance level of knowing where that work came from, all of its stops along the way, and that it'll go forward in the future with much more precision, and that the whole kind of economics around it can be enhanced by potentially having it live within a token economy, whether that's through fractionalization or that's through kind of collective ownership. We have had a few things come through, like a Stradivarius violin and some other things that have been desired to be collectively owned, but it's complicated at this time to pull that off. So that group is really much more focused on the certificate and the insurance and the provenance factors of what we provide. The second group, the luxury group, where there's watches, fashion goods, automobiles, and so forth, that's much more about the secondary market and the proof factors that we can provide around there as well. They're also kind of straddling into the supply chain and showing up within it as well, so that the fashion houses can have their own fully transparent but fully controlled permissioned system of their own, so that they're not having to deal with competitive frictions. But they really want that individualized per product precision around how that product is either coming right off the line or it's being transferred with all the provenance benefits and insurance, most importantly, that it is such going forward. Then there's collectibles and digital media, where we're spanning virtual to physical hybrid packages of bundled content, as Sarah was saying. What do you get? Well, in our case, you get a ton of stuff. You're getting effectively new content and storytelling, in some cases recreation of vintage moments, like with Kobe Bryant. We've got something coming from him and his legacy, to new things with our guest that you'll see in the workshop, who's blending the world of fashion and physical goods with the virtual currencies and other things that go along with NFT. So to wrap it up, it really is about kind of designing for those industry perspectives and delivering the substrate of the tech, so that no one actually really needs to investigate that other than to know it's there and they can rely on it. They really are experiencing that good or that content or that kind of ownership kind of market that they want to participate in. We really want to become invisible and the intel inside.
That's great. And I think there, since we're reached 12:10, we've got 20 minutes now for submitted questions. I see 2 in the chat thus far, and maybe the first could go to, it's the first on the list. So it's initially a question for Ryan. What do you think about the recent credibility crisis of NFTs? So I guess some of the things we've touched on, but there's been some news around an OpenSea executive going potentially to prison, and a whole bunch of other kind of harsh legal outcomes for people who have been maybe on the pushing the boundaries of what is legit.
I don't know about harsh.
probably appropriate, I should say, but harsh in that I don't think a lot of people in the space quite knew what they were getting into. And maybe if they did, they were hoping that there would be a sort of, I don't know, that the conversation would move faster.
Well, I mean, the question's for Ryan, but I will say that there are regulations coming. Like, people need to be aware that this is not going to be the way to get around existing consumer protection and securities laws and anti-money laundering and, you know, all kinds of other things. Like, those rules are in place for a reason. And so despite the desire of a lot of the base in the Web3 community to have no rules, to really pursue a libertarian utopia, like, that's not going to happen. There are going to be rules, and people are going to have to comply because people are losing money, people are being taken advantage of. Like, there are bad things happening in this space that need to be not happening in order for it to be sustainable. But we could talk more about those legal implications, but I'll let Ryan answer the question he was asked.
No, thank you. I mean, I'm sure you know way more about this than I do, but just from being at the level, I've heard a lot of discussions, and also understanding like the discussions of securities and how these NFTs are, how they're taxed on secondary markets, all this discussion. But I think a lot of it comes down to education. I mean, as we said, like, the crypto space came with a lot of like notion around the dark net. So there was a lot of illegal transactions and activity that originally came to it when its nascent level way back in the inception. And now I think it's a moment for us to have a little bit of this like legality come through. We're having a cleansing session, but more importantly, I think the education is what needs to happen. Speaking back about what you said, that was about the theft and things like this that are associated with the industry, is we're seeing more and more of this at a scale or that we haven't seen before. And I think it's because a lot of people are coming into the space, they're getting excited, and they're not following very simple protocols that should be spelled out from the initial standpoint. So that's why I came back to the educational portion of this. And I think it's so important that when we do bring the onboarding process in, we do teach people, this is a seed phrase. You do not write that down on the internet. You don't put it on your browser. You don't take a photo. And I'm certain that Lemire is going to go over all these details a little bit later. But these are the important things I think that people need to understand. They need to understand how to read websites. There's a lot of duplicated websites out there that are trying to be something else. And then when you connect with it via Web3, you know, we're having terrible repercussions of like, well, it's being drained and things like this. But it's really important, I think, that we take a step back and really focus on how we narrate the educational process, not only for collectors, but for creators, for people who are even taking their step into it for the first time. People who may not even have a wallet set up yet, may just be looking into NFTs for the first time, because the moment that people enter into the crypto space or the Web3 space, it's really important to make sure that they have a seamless, enjoyable experience and aren't taken for granted.
Well, and I'm remembering just in the past, things like credit card companies sending elderly people credit cards that they sign up for that all of a sudden are creating all sorts of interest and problems. And we're still not around that. We still have an environment where sort of the hawk that is trying to kind of get a sort of vulnerable person in their talons, that's a big part of the system that we are confronting, is the legacy of that, of manipulation, of promise of a product or a particular outcome, and what really is being agreed to. So Sarah, how do artists and designers in the space protect themselves and be cautious? What are some of the principles you bring to that in your clients and practice?
Well, of course, I've got a very self-interested answer, which is talk to a lawyer. But you know, part of the problem is that people are trying so hard to be innovative. And so let's look at the well-meaning creatives who are in the space. like there is a lot of unintentional crossing of boundaries because people think they're coming up with innovative ideas, but in fact, these are exactly the ideas that have created securities laws, you know, so that people, when the predators and the bad actors come into the space, don't take advantage of those interesting structures that you've tried to put together. So as we see user-generated content become a much bigger part of this space, which is exciting and fun and engaging and could create all kinds of wonderful things, you know, at what point does somebody's engagement with a project rise to the level of being a security interest? Well, as soon as you have, you know, things like the expectation of earning profits, or which is a big part of what Web3 is about too, is about each person being able to benefit from their own contributions to the space. But as soon as there's an expectation of profits, or that this idea of decentralization, if you dig down, it's really not so decentralized, it's actually centralized somewhere. And that group of people is driving the show and figuring out what's going to make money and not. Like, as soon as things get into that speculative realm, you begin to have problems. So I do think that, as Ryan says, education is part of it. And that's certainly part of doing outreach and getting more people engaged in the space and having a good experience. But you're always going to have the predators. You're always going to have the people who are looking for the angle through which they can make money or take advantage of people, or, you know, whatever. And that's really, unfortunately, where the rules come in. And so I think we need to have more than just protocols that we expect people to follow and ask people to engage in nicely. We need to actually have rules in terms of what is acceptable and what's not. And, you know, to some degree, that undermines a lot of the desires of the Web3 community. On the other hand, we can have Web3, we can have some of this decentralized decision making, but we do need rules of governance. We do need rules of engagement, and those things need to be enforceable. And that, of course, also, and I don't want to unravel the sweater so far that we can't get back to the center here, but you know, we get back to this question of anonymity or pseudonymity on the blockchain, where, you know, when you have that wallet, you are not known by your name, you are known by a number. And so in many cases, you can figure it out, you can trace back and figure out who owns that wallet. But in a lot of cases, especially if people are using this system in order to avoid detection, it provides a way of hiding and committing bad acts with potentially no consequences. So there are a lot of things still to be worked out here. And I would say that the big word for me for this year would be compromise. We all have to compromise a bit in order to get to a place where we can all function, enjoy the benefits of this new universe, move everything into the metaverse that makes sense to move there and interact with, but also to be protected. And for people who maybe don't want to learn all the technical ins and outs of everything, but just want to engage, can do so safely without fear of being taken advantage of.
That's great. And a follow-on question. We'll go through as many of these as possible. I know some folks have been putting questions in the chat. If you kindly would add them, you can copy them just straight into the Q&A so that we have them in there if we've missed anything. So a second question for the group maybe is, which metaverse environment platform does anybody think the retail stores will eventually settle on? So wearables and soft goods and the metaverse. So is there a direction that's going in that we should be aware of? You know, knowing that some of the major technology companies are thinking about proprietary metaverse approaches where it's sort of a lockbox like Meta might be, or other alternatives.
I would throw out there that many of them have already kind of experimented, at least at this stage, with Decentraland. It's one of the longest standing, and the way that they've designed it to be browser optimized, they're able to go in and make the media PR splash that they really are really focused on, more so than anything else. They might have some physical retail kind of triggers within it. A group called Boson Protocol focuses on that, where you see a virtual good, you can have it shipped to you in an Amazon kind of delivery mechanism and so forth. So I think that's what I've observed, and maybe Sandbox just thereafter, but primarily in the kind of typical, web GL kind of space, they've shown up there. And then there's an Unreal Engine wave of other realms coming to life, like Wild World and some of the others. And but I think that's going to be a continually tough sell to non-crypto people. Just my opinion.
Do you think that when you look at things, there's also going to be a shift, not just from the physical into the wearable that we see in NFTs right now, mostly coming from fashion, sport, but also in the opposite direction, where we're going to see things like the epic metaverse ecosystem come into the physical world?
I think in the world of sports, yes. I see a few key things happening there. Perhaps some of the entertainment gaming property kind of mashups. But beyond that, I kind of struggle a little bit to see.
Do you think the technology could come in? Maybe not necessarily the digital assets or the game mechanics, but some of the underpinning technologies that facilitate that?
Oh, I see a lot more innovation happening in the education level, where architecture schools are now using Unreal Engine in the UK and so forth, and the hybridization of those tools absolutely is happening for sure in real time.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, and then moving to Andrew's question here, and Maggie, I would love for you to take this one. We've already addressed it a little bit, but what is being done in the NFT marketplace to make it more environmentally safe? Where can artists post NFTs without contributing to global warming? Tezos being one, Ryan.
Yeah, I'd say Tezos. That's the one that came to mind for me too. And if you might not like Tezos, the business model, go look at Tezos for its paradigm and for what its different features are, and then see who else provides those features. It's almost kind of old-fashioned matrix. What's most important to you and how do you balance them? And I think Ryan mentioned something earlier, which is like you can literally see your gas costs going down. And that also helps you understand, well, what is the overall infrastructural cost? And therefore, if it's a lower gas cost, does that actually mean that it's got a less onerous environmental impact? I think it can, when you think about this, when you talk about the environment for NFTs, I think you might also want to look at where is it mined, right? And does that, how do you look at not just NFTs? I'd actually request that we think about this for all kinds of digital transactions. The cloud is a real place. It's a server farm and it's hot. All right, so we've known this for some time. So in some ways, when we're talking about the carbon footprint, we're really amplifying an issue that exists anyway. But I think one of the things that is difficult is when people say, well, I would think that would be fine for med tech, but for gaming, really? So I think you also have to make a choice about the systems in which you're looking at that, right? So those are the places I would start to look at. You might look for proof, as you mentioned, proof of stake, which is what Ryan mentioned, Tezos, Symbol, Polygon. Compared to the old Ethereum 33, what was it called, 33.57, or it had a number, right? So Ethereum says it's going to transition to proof of stakes, and they're looking for what they call stakers. So we're also seeing a shift in moving from a miner to being a staker. So these are some of the things that you might want to look for instead of a proof of work. Look for a proof of stake. So yeah, you do need to do a little bit of research. Mer.
Yeah, I just wanted to tag on to that as well. I think it also comes back to how your engineers and developers are working with you, and what languages are they working in. For instance, if they're Solidity based, where they've been working in Ethereum, maybe they look at something like Moonbeam, which is on the Polkadot network, which will be a quick, easy port for them. If they're into sustainability, maybe they also look at Flow, which is another one that Top Shots uses that also touts this environmental sustainability. But I think also, lastly, you want to look at some of the systems that are fully integrated, full stack as well. And it's going to be a bit of a full-on research project for you if you really into that, but you kind of have to also balance out what's the full cloud stack, as Maggie's mentioning, not just the protocol, because they're actually living on other services as well that you can't see, and they're not calculating that additional set of energy draw that they're pulling.
Yeah, and for anybody who really wants to get into it, there's a report that was done by Cambridge University. They did the second global crypto asset benchmarking, and there's now a third one that's a little bit more recent, and they talk about these differences over different countries and different companies. Again, I'm not familiar with some of the alternative research, but that's some of the stuff that allowed me to start, for example, understanding the benchmarking. What do you benchmark and how it changes over time and over places. So I think it kind of helps you understand the difference also between exchanges, payments. I think of the art market as they do as kind of custody, different forms of being a custodian of stuff, and then the actual engineering of mining. And so it really depends what we mean by environmental impact and where it lives in the ecosystem of the platform you're using.
I just want to play devil's advocate for 1 minute, and I will say that I've been a huge proponent of all kinds of proof of stake systems. Algorand is another one that's doing really interesting work and is rooted in very interesting intellectual approaches. So I definitely have been in favor of looking at proof of stake, but I want to say two things. One is that, you know, I do think that there's a little bit of unfairness in the conversation around pushing this all to creatives, that it's somehow artists' responsibility to be paying attention and leading the way for everything. And so, you know, artists end up getting the short end of the stick most of the time. So it's important for that to be balanced, the ability to make a living to be balanced with those environmental concerns, along with many other concerns. So I think it's important not to call out artists who are minting on Ethereum as somehow being bad or, you know, awful people. Because there are other aspects to this conversation, and somebody in the chat actually raised the question of how proof of stake reinforces power structures that blockchain evangelists seek to undermine. I think that's a really good point. You know, the idea was, and this goes back to something that Mer said originally about scalability. Like the idea of the Ethereum blockchain with this proof of work, it was very democratic, right? Anybody could engage and earn through mining. They could earn that currency. But the problem is, as you scale up and as you get people jumping in, trying to beat everybody else with the, you know, the solving of those algorithms, that's when you get the computer farms that are sucking up all the energy and creating all the problems. Proof of stake, though, is not perfect, because then what you're doing is you're allowing the system to be run by the people who have the most resources to stake in the first place. So, you know, again, when we're talking about equity, inclusion, diversity, access, those things are not necessarily taken care of with a proof of stake system. And those are other things that need to be considered in figuring out how we want to build out the space in general.
I think
Sorry,
there's
Ryan.
No. Great. I think that basically we're at the very nascent level still, even though we're almost a decade into this space. So we are still definitely ironing out all the details, figuring out how to make things, going back to what I said earlier about the original decentralization of the blockchain. And I think it's to the point where, like, we do have so many different verticals. We have, like, let's call them the actual developers within the space, and then we have the artists that are going to be bridging that gap. And I think that there's going to be a moment in time where the artists or the creatives don't have to even think about this anymore. You know, they need to have their free mind so that then they can create new protocols and have new ways of working, new UX, new creative strategies. But due to the fact that we are where we are right now, we are still having these conversations. And I think it's important. And I think it's also a benefit that we do have the creative minds engaged in this right now, because typically they do find more unique solutions than we would if we were just a bunch of, like, die-hard focused engineers focusing on this problem. So it is definitely something that's upon us. I think that we do have the strategies to create some new exciting protocols, some new exciting infrastructures, blockchains, all the above. So very exciting times, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I see we're coming to the end of it, and I'm looking through the chat. So there's some, I wanted to share for our interaction and MDP students, we're going to have a breakout session in a couple of weeks. It's going to be specifically around what this means in our practice. So I'm excited for those questions. I'm really excited to hear that technically, and even in terms of governance, we can resolve, at least we can debate, resolve this so that we can get back to the new creative medium. And some of the questions are around what we think it'll mean for the physical world. I think this whole idea of in real life, physical and metaverse is we're kind of giving ourselves some false dichotomies here. And I think that physical things will be built with a digital component, a digital existence. And I think twinning is a key concept for that. And likewise, I think our digital assets are going to be considered to be a currency and asset, but also an entity with behavior and interactions in the physical and digital world too. And I'm kind of excited to get there.
Yeah, indeed. And also these chat comments and questions are fantastic. I mean, I hope we are able to save these or let us have a Reddit moment collectively to answer some of these in our own way. This is great.
Well, so and to that point in time and to where we are on the actual clock here, we're going to sort of end this portion of the panel and introduce our special guest, who you may have a sense of, who's joined us here in the panel, but I'll let Mer do the intro. But before we get into the workshop, just a few sort of housekeeping, administrative things for you to keep in mind. So this is the start of a series. The series is designed to last the length of the summer, but also designed to inform our relationship with Web3 and the education around that in an ongoing way. So save the date for July 9th. You'll receive a survey about today. Should you not join the workshop, you'll receive a survey and a request to submit proposals for case studies. So we're really looking at the next session to hear from the community inside out, to say, what have we been doing and where do we need to look? And that will be July 9th, Saturday, and you'll get information in a survey and a save the date similarly to what you've had today. For the questions that we haven't addressed, those will definitely be noted, and Mer, we will continue to bring this group into the conversation as needed and as appropriate and as available too. So you're not on the hook for anything, Sarah and Ryan, just yet, but stay tuned. So I guess thank you all for that expansive, boundary challenging discussion. It really touched on the key principles. It addressed some of the most significant questions. And more importantly, it shows the types of dialogues that we need to be having that are really about both systems and structures and content and meaning. And that is really ArtCenter's sweet spot. So stay with us in this and stay close, and we will, of course, be there to support you in your journeys in this space. So thank you, Maggie, Ryan, Sarah, Mer. We were so lucky to have had you this afternoon now, and we will follow up in the days to come. And if you'd like to stay, you're welcome to as well, but no need to be on the hook for extra Saturday time unless you really, really want to.
I wish I could stay because it sounds really exciting and I really want that Paul Frank engagement, but another time. But thank you so much for having me, and good luck with everything. This is a wonderful series.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been incredible. I love meeting new faces, former alums as well. And it's really exciting to have minds that are in the space that kind of want to start to mold this and move forward, and so that we can actually come to a really special time. So thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.
And I'm going to say thank you, Robbie, for organizing, convening, moderating, and also to my co-panelists, the questions, and also the generosity, right? We're also talking about things we don't know or things we don't quite understand yet. And I think that's like the core of why this community comes together. So I'm going to say thank you. And I'm going to go on to mute and stop video because I definitely want to see what Mer and Paul Frank are going to conjure up.
All right, thank you, Maggie. And so with that,